In a world where global economics meets reality TV drama, two superpowers decided to settle their differences through the ancient art of taxation warfare. This is the unauthorized story of the US-China trade war, the economic conflict that proved international diplomacy could be conducted entirely through Twitter feuds, passive-aggressive tariffs, and the unshakable belief that somebody, somewhere, was definitely getting ripped off. From 2018 to 2025, the world's two largest economies transformed global trade into the most expensive economic reality show in history. Featuring weaponized soybeans, semiconductor sanctions, and tariffs so high they broke calculators. This is the story of how two countries proved that when it comes to international trade, sometimes the best way to hurt your enemy is to shoot yourself in the foot first. Our tale begins in 2016, when Donald J. Trump looked at America's $347 billion trade deficit with China and thought to himself, you know what this complex economic relationship needs? More drama. Since the 1980s, Trump had advocated tariffs to eliminate the U.S. trade deficit and promote domestic manufacturing, saying the country was being ripped off by its trading partners, a philosophy about to be stress-tested on the world's most important bilateral relationship. Most presidents consult economists and trade experts. Trump had something more powerful: his gut, a Twitter account, and an unshakable belief that trade deficits work like personal checking accounts. In January 2018, Trump announced 30% tariffs on imported solar cells and tariffs ranging from 20 to 50% on certain washing machines, because apparently clean clothes and clean energy were threatening American values. China's response was swift. We can play this game too. And thus began the most expensive game of economic chicken in modern history. What started as trade policy quickly became agricultural warfare. In July 2018, China stopped purchasing US-produced soybeans in retaliation to US tariffs on Chinese imports, marking the beginnings of the trade war as we know it. Yes, folks, the opening shot in the Great Economic War was fired at beans, because nothing says national security threat quite like legumes. Soybean farmers lost an estimated $24 billion in exports and accounted for the predominant number of increasing farm bankruptcies in 2018. Between 2017 and 2018, China's share of U.S. soybean exports dropped from 62% to 18%. That's not market adjustment, that's economic whiplash. By September 2018, the U.S. places 10% taxes on used $200 billion of Chinese imports. China responds by placing customs duties on used $60 billion of U.S. goods. American farmers discovered their crops had become unwilling soldiers in an international economic war. Picture the conversation. Honey, why can't we sell our soybeans? Well, America and China are having a disagreement about intellectual property, so our beans are now weapons of economic warfare. Traditional diplomacy involves embassies and careful negotiations. Trump diplomacy involved tweeting at 6 a.m. and hoping President Xi was awake to read it. Sample diplomatic communication. China is doing very badly, the worst year in 27 years. They want to make a deal. Followed by, just had a long and very good conversation with President Xi of China. Deal is moving along very well. It was like watching international relations conducted by someone whose diplomatic training consisted entirely of watching The Apprentice. In October 2018, Vice President Mike Pence delivered a speech marking the clearest articulation yet of the Trump administration's policy toward China, condemning what he called growing Chinese military aggression, because apparently the trade war needed more drama. China's diplomatic response was the international equivalent of responding to someone yelling by speaking very quietly while maintaining unblinking eye contact. In January 2020, after 2 years of economic warfare, both sides declared victory by signing Phase 1 of a trade deal. China committed to buying an additional $200 billion worth of U.S. goods above 2017 levels by the end of 2021. Trump called it the greatest trade deal ever made. China called it, well, they were too polite to say, but then 2020 happened. You know, that minor hiccup called a global pandemic that made everyone forget about trade wars because they were too busy panic buying toilet paper. Researchers in 2022 said that China had bought goods worth only 58% of the amount it had committed to purchasing, proving that even during global pandemics, homework assignments are hard to complete. Plot twist. Those tariffs designed to hurt China? Turns out they were mostly paid by American companies and American consumers. It's like declaring war on your neighbor by punching yourself in the face. American consumers discovered that Made in USA alternatives cost 47% more and came with existential crisis about global supply chains. Enter Joe Biden in 2021, who inherited this economic masterpiece and thought, well, this is special. Despite criticizing Trump's tariffs during the 2020 campaign for harming American families, Biden caved to political pressure after entering office. He not only sustained Trump's tariffs, but added to them throughout his tenure. The Biden administration kept the tariffs in place and added additional levies on Chinese goods, such as electric vehicles and solar panels. But Biden's innovation? He went full economic Thanos and started making entire industries disappear from China's reach through export controls. Biden introduced far-reaching export control measures that leveraged America's critical position in specific supply chains to restrict China's access to advanced chips essential for driving economic and military innovation. In May 2024, Biden increased tariffs from 25% to 100% on electric vehicles, 50% on solar cells, and 25% on electric vehicle batteries. It was like inheriting a house on fire and deciding the best solution was adding more fire, but make it targeted fire that only burns specific rooms. January 2025. Trump returns with a simple message. You thought the first trade war was fun? Hold my Diet Coke. 2025 marked a significant escalation under the second Trump administration. A series of increasing tariffs led to the U.S. imposing a 145% tariff on Chinese goods and China imposing a 125% tariff on American goods. Let that sink in. 145%. That's not a tariff, that's economic exile with extra steps. President Trump declared that foreign trade and economic practices have created a national emergency, imposing a 10% tariff on all countries using powers typically reserved for actual emergencies. On April 9th, the U.S.'s 145% tariff on Chinese goods came into effect. China matched with escalating responses. China also began requiring special licenses to export 6 heavy rare earths, 100% of which were refined in China, and rare earth magnets, 90% of which are produced in China. Translation: China took their rare earth metals and went home, leaving American tech companies staring at supply chains like parents whose kids took away their PlayStation. The Chinese Finance Ministry said China would ignore any further U.S. tariff increases, diplomatic speak, or I know you are, but what am I in Mandarin? What happened next was economic escalation chicken played by people who really hate backing down. Trump raised tariffs by an additional 50%, bringing the baseline to 104%. China added 50%, reaching 84%. The US then raised to 145%, and China raised to 125%. Average US tariffs on imports from China had increased to 126.5% in early May 2025, a number so absurd it transcended economics and entered performance art. The tariffs amount to an average tax increase of nearly $1,200 per U.S. household in 2025. That's not policy. That's a surprise subscription service nobody asked for. Meanwhile, companies were having conversations like, should we source from China? What's the tariff rate this week? Depends. What day is it? Tuesday. Morning or afternoon Tuesday. Trust me, it matters. Chinese e-commerce company Temu said it would stop selling goods from China directly to U.S. customers after Trump closed the de minimis exemption, making small packages subject to massive duties. Buying a $5 phone case suddenly cost $110 in total fees. Economic whiplash, delivered to your doorstep. By May 2025, both countries had reached tariff levels so ridiculous they were conducting trade through interpretive dance and strongly worded letters. Finally, cooler heads prevailed. The the United States and China agreed to a 90-day suspension as of May 12, 2025. U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods will be lowered from 145% to 30%. China will reduce tariffs from 125% to 10%. The Swiss found themselves mediating between superpowers, having a very expensive public argument. Swiss officials were probably thinking, "We make watches and chocolate. How did we become responsible for preventing global economic collapse?" U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said, "Both countries represented their national interests clearly. We both have an interest in balanced trade." Translation: "We have no idea what we're doing, but we're committed to figuring it out later." Trump did not elaborate on what part of the agreement Beijing may have breached during later tensions, proving that even truces in trade wars come with asterisks. The real Olympic sport wasn't economics. It was watching corporations navigate trade policy that changed faster than their supply chains. Companies played economic twister. Left hand on Vietnam manufacturing, right foot on Mexican assembly. Now spin 3 times and hope your supply chain doesn't collapse. Apple's Tim Cook said most iPhones sold in the US would come from India, with iPads and other devices imported from Vietnam, trillion-dollar companies essentially playing manufacturing musical chairs. Trump threatens a 25% tariff on Apple products unless its iPhones are made in the US, proving even tech giants aren't immune to policy conducted through executive ultimatum. Tesla found itself owned by someone supporting tariffs while building cars in China for Chinese customers. Personal conflict on an international scale. Small businesses had conversations, like, should we stockpile inventory? From where? Anywhere not currently in a trade war. That's getting harder to find. Export controls were introduced for chipmaker NVIDIA, Yangtze Memory Technologies, and Changshin Memory Technologies. Semiconductors became the new oil, except more complicated and with more acronyms. After 7 years of tweets, tariffs, and economic chaos that would make Adam Smith weep, who actually won? Let's consult our official scorecard. America's achievements. Learned trade wars are not, in fact, easy to win. Discovered tariffs are taxes. You pay to yourself. Achieved unprecedented Twitter-based diplomacy. Proved economics can be conducted like reality TV. China's wins. Found new trading partners who don't conduct foreign policy through social media. Discovered rare earth metals are economic kryptonite. Got front row seats to the world's longest economic reality show. Learned that patience is a virtue in trade negotiations. The real winners. Economists who said, "I told you so," for 7 straight years. International trade lawyers who made enough money to buy small countries. Vietnam, Mexico, and Bangladesh, who became accidental beneficiaries. China is also the 3rd largest export market for the United States, with U.S. exports exceeding $195 billion in 2024. That year's $295 billion U.S. trade deficit with China is the lowest since 2009, proving something worked, though nobody's sure what. The U.S.-China trade war proved several important lessons. Economic policy shouldn't be made at 3 a.m. on Twitter. Tariffs are taxes your own people pay. Trade wars are easy to win is not actually true. Soybeans make terrible weapons. Sometimes the best way to hurt your enemy is to hurt yourself first. The U.S.-China trade war, the economic conflict that proved international diplomacy, could be conducted through social media, passive-aggressive tariffs, and weaponized agriculture. It may not have solved the trade deficit, restored American manufacturing to 1950s levels, or made China play by rules nobody could define. But it did provide 7 years of the most entertaining economic policy in modern history. In the end, both sides agreed they'd rather pretend it was a success than admit they'd spent 7 years in the world's most expensive Twitter argument, with occasional breaks for actual diplomacy. This was the unauthorized story of the U.S.-China trade war, the economic conflict that nobody won. Everybody paid for, and somehow convinced millions that international trade could be improved through the power of social media and wishful thinking. From soybeans to semiconductors, from tweets to tariffs, this was economics meets reality TV, and reality won. A soybean farmer looks at his phone, reads a tweet about trade policy, sighs deeply, and says, "Well, at least the memes were good."